So we've talked a lot about Arthur Schopenhauer over the past 2 weeks. And as you can tell from the episode title, we're going to talk about him a little bit more. But to begin talking about the topic this week, which is Nietzsche's essay, Schopenhauer as Educator, we're not actually going to start out talking about Schopenhauer himself. Schopenhauer will obviously be a big part of the episode. But the underlying question that Nietzsche was grappling with in writing the essay, Schopenhauer as Educator, is in a sense only incidental to Schopenhauer's ideas as such. There was an unresolved question that was at the center of Nietzsche's thoughts as of the period of his work when he was writing the Untimely Meditations. When we covered the use and abuse of history for life, which is the second such essay in that series, we didn't really go into the background of the Untimely Meditations essays, which we'll do now, because I think it's now more relevant. The title in German is Unzeitgemäße Betrachtungen, or Betrachtungen, probably. It's closer. Perhaps my favorite title, or my favorite translation of the title of this work was given by H.L. Mencken, who wrote in his book on Nietzsche that, quote, he planned a series of 24 pamphlets and decided to call them Unzeitgemäße Betrachtungen, which may be translated as inopportune speculations, or more clearly, essays in sham smashing, end quote. And Mencken gives the number of planned essays there as 24. On Wikipedia, it says 13, based on Nietzsche's notes. Who knows what his original goal was, but he only published 4. These essays were written in the 1870s. They were all written after Nietzsche's first book, Birth of Tragedy, but they're written during his university career. He published 3 of the essays within a 2-year span, and then he took a couple years off and published the 4th essay, which was on the topic of Wagner. There's also an unpublished 5th essay called We Philologists. So it was an ambitious project, but it seemed like it ran out of steam or was interrupted somehow. Nietzsche never fully carried it out. What's interesting to me, though, the broad topics that you could glean from the chapter titles that he laid out of the planned essays, they're fairly similar to the titles of the different books of Human All Too Human, or the chapter headings of Human All Too Human, his first book in philosophy that would cover a broad range of sweeping, topics. And this was written at the end of abandoning the Untimely Meditations and at the end of Nietzsche's university career. So I can't help but wonder if maybe the common or the conventional historical understanding of what was happening there isn't perhaps wrong, that perhaps he didn't abandon the project, but simply reformulated it into a book-length form rather than continuing to write on these ideas piecemeal. So we never got an essay about, like one of the essay titles is like War, State, and Family or something like that. But there's a chapter on that, called, I forget what it's called. It's like a glance at the state in Human All Too Human, or Peoples and Fatherlands, and Beyond Good and Evil. So all of this work during the Untimely Meditations period, I think, culminated in that. And then during this period, he attacked conventional ideas and popular figures with these essays. Nietzsche is acting as a cultural critic, first and foremost. That's what he's doing in these essays. These essays are written from the perspective of someone out of step with modern thinking, which is why possible translations for these essays include the titles Thoughts Out of Season, or Untimely Meditations, that these are thoughts that are literally untimely in the sense of arriving late or arriving too early. Truths or ideas which are anathema to the values or underlying presumptions of our time. And by the way, the branding I use for this podcast's feed and my blog, the name Untimely Reflections is obviously a riff on the names for these essays by Nietzsche. Schopenhauer as Educator was published in 1874, the same year as Use and Abuse of History for Life. So that was the most productive period of the Untimely Meditations. And in my view, Schopenhauer as Educator is the heart of the Untimely Meditations, because here Nietzsche expresses most fully the sense he has of himself being untimely. He speaks of his own intellectual development and his education through the example of his chosen mentor, Schopenhauer, and thus Nietzsche is offering words of advice to other untimely people. He's giving himself as an example, relating his experience as an untimely person. And the central problem of the essay is the sorry state of education and culture in Nietzsche's society. What he saw as an underdeveloped and often superficial culture, and the lack of a coherent, motivating ideal for the upcoming generations to follow in the footsteps of. More importantly, however, as I said at the outset of the podcast, Nietzsche has a sort of question in his philosophical project up to this point. He just wrote in Use and Abuse of History for Life of the misuse of historical education and the damage that an excess of historical thinking could do to a culture. In that essay, he writes of the possibility of the supra-historical man, whom Nietzsche hints is his goal for the future of mankind. A supra-historical person, in that person's outlook, quote, does not envisage salvation in the process, end quote. But for the supra-historical person, quote, the world is finished in every moment, and its end is attained. What could 10 new years teach that the past could not teach? End quote. And so Nietzsche answers that same rhetorical question posed at the very beginning of Use and Abuse of History with this quote in part 9 of the essay, quote, the goal of humanity cannot lie in the end, but only in its highest specimens, end quote. Walter Kaufmann's commentary on this sentence is illuminating. He writes in his book on Nietzsche, Nietzsche, Philosopher, Psychologist, Antichrist, on page 149, quote, perhaps there is no more basic statement of Nietzsche's philosophy in all his writings than this sentence. Here is the most crucial point of his philosophy of history and theory of values, no less than the clue to his aristocratic ethics and his opposition to socialism and democracy. The sentence also shows how the historical and supra-historical are finally integrated. In the highest specimens of humanity, we envisage the meaning of life and history. What can an additional 10 or 20 centuries bring to light that we could not find in contemplating Aeschylus and Heraclitus, Socrates and Jesus, Leonardo and Michelangelo, Shakespeare and Goethe, Caesar and Napoleon, or Plato and Spinoza? In them, the events of history have truly been intensified into symbols. End quote. And Kaufmann goes on to give what I consider to be a very compelling argument that Nietzsche's problem here is a direct result of his rejection of God and, more broadly, his rejection of supernatural or transcendent grounding for reality and for our lives. To Nietzsche, we are simply, quote, clever animals who invented knowledge, as he writes in the essay on Truth and Lies in the Non-Moral Sense. While the announcement of the death of God is years away from this essay, he hadn't written it yet, Nietzsche is already philosophizing fully outside of Christianity and outside of what he saw as the inherited metaphysics and morality of Christianity that had corrupted even secular philosophy. And so he's thinking outside of these presuppositions. Without these presuppositions, man is simply one among many animals. We may have our intelligence or our sentience, but as we all know, we share this trait with the chimps and, the dolphins and the whales and the orangutans and possibly even animals such as elephants and pigs, might have some degree of sentience. There's even something possibly approaching self-awareness in corvids, crows. So humankind maybe has a quantitative advantage over these animals, and that we have more intelligence, more sapience than they do, at least by all accounts. But there's no qualitative difference. We just happen to be the cleverest, but we're still just clever animals. Kaufman continues in the passage, quote, "What is worthless to start with cannot acquire value by multiplication. If man's value is zero, no addition of such zeros will ever lead to any value. A steady increase of intelligence through history, even if it could be demonstrated, would not change this picture. If man is to have any worth, there must be a qualitative leap, to use Hegel's apt expression. That there are any such leaps, Nietzsche has not shown so far. His statement, however, that, quote, the goal of humanity cannot lie in the end, is thus explained, and so is the addition that, if there is any goal, it can only be found in what he calls the highest specimens, end quote." And so we've lingered for a while on Kaufman's analysis of this, really just a handful of sentences from the essay before Schopenhauer's Educator, from Use and Abuse of History for Life. But we're talking about the essay before this one because it sets up quite nicely the problem Nietzsche is trying to solve when writing Schopenhauer as Educator. Men are in their essence animals. What it is that we find transcendentally valuable about humankind cannot ever be cobbled together by a naturalistic understanding of mankind as simply an animal among animals who obtain their intellect merely by chance. Furthermore, there's no end goal for humanity, no teleology for humanity in such a world system. If we reject the noumenon as a matter of taste and as merely a matter of course for us, and consider only phenomenal reality as real, then the argument for progress as such becomes rather difficult. There could be progress towards one set of moral aims, but every society has its own set of moral values which are relative to that time and place, and when circumstances change and societies rise and fall, moral projects are abandoned or destroyed and new ones are created. Progress towards a specific moral aim is perfectly comprehensible, but there are no universal moral aims, and thus the idea of progress as such is impossible. What could 10 more years give us that the last 10 did not already give? And so to summarize, Nietzsche had already begun the work of the revaluation of all values even at this early date, insofar as he's asking these questions, insofar as he's aware of the problem caused by the abandonment of the Christian framework for metaphysical and moral thought. And he is trying to replace it with something else that can fulfill the same roles. Unfortunately, within the naturalistic worldview of, say, Darwin, this is not possible, in Nietzsche's opinion, because it never actually replaces what Christianity provided, because you never get to a view of mankind as valuable in a transcendent sense, in a sense that transcends the other objects and phenomena of reality, or, in contrast, just the other animals. Nietzsche thinks that it's essential that we have this grounding to our lives and to our thought. He thought that was a healthy, you might say that was a healthy illusion that Christianity preserved. But so now we have to find it purely within nature. But there's that age-old saying, natura non facit saltus, which means nature does not make leaps. And so what Nietzsche is looking for is some leap from the merely animal world to something which transcends that world. In a word, human, a truly human being, something no longer animal. And so he writes in Schopenhauer as Educator, Part 5, quote, "If universal nature leads up to man, it is to show us that he is necessary to redeem her from the curse of the beast's life, and that in him existence can find a mirror of itself wherein life appears no longer blind, but in its real metaphysical significance. But we should consider where the beast ends and man begins. The man, the one concern of nature. As long as anyone desires life as a pleasure in itself, he has not raised his eyes above the horizon of the beast. He only desires more consciously what the beast seeks by blind impulse. It is so with us all, for the greater part of our lives. We do not shake off the beast, but are beasts ourselves, suffering we know not what." End quote. I think this is such a beautiful statement of Nietzsche's rejection of hedonism, or to put it into more modern terms, utilitarianism, any philosophy based on relishing, or on pleasure and pain, or any system where the good of life is relishing sense pleasures. That's simply a more intelligent means of fulfilling the same beastly urges of the animal kingdom. And the same with even if you put it into negative hedonism, I think you would still have that same fundamental problem. If the good is pleasure and the bad is pain, you're still basically just fulfilling the same thing that any animal would the same ends that they would aim at. You're just doing it in a more conscious, more sophisticated way. And I don't think, probably a lot of secular thinkers probably wouldn't deny that. We might recognize here in this passage the influence of Schopenhauer's thought, the idea that the fundamental subjective experience of all things is of the same substance, that is to say, the experience of blindly willing. The only difference between human beings and animals in that respect is the different form they take, and the fact that humans have this intellect that can represent the world in a way that the animal cannot. And thus humans are the will just as much as animals, but in full comprehension of what the will is and what the nature of the will is. And Nietzsche here also takes an avowedly anthropic view of reality itself. Man is the one concern of nature. And you could take that as a poetic statement or a philosophical one. For the purposes of the essay, whatever his intentions, Nietzsche does seem to operate within this framework. So remember, in Schopenhauer's work, man is the support for the existence of reality itself, because without the human half of the world of representation, the subject to perceive the objects, there is no reality. For Nietzsche, dwelling entirely in the phenomenal world, having rejected metaphysics and God and all that, or metaphysical, ontological worlds, the ontological world. Having rejected that, Nietzsche is entirely within the phenomenal world, where humanity has its particular form of sense perceptions and linguistic conceptual boundaries for representing the world. Humanity is similarly an inextricable component of the production of the reality it experiences, but there is no absolute perceiver or immaculate perception. And so this is the mindset you have to get into in order for man to become the sole concern of nature, in order to make a statement like that. Without man, there is no nature, because nature is, by the definition of the way that we experience it, it's a human concept. And when we talk about it, we're talking about a set of human experiences that we've then put into a conceptual framework. And so, anyway, to get back to a full sort of restatement of the problem Nietzsche is looking at here, simply by our intellect alone, we do not become some sort of higher being. We do not become transcendently valuable. Mankind as a species is not redeemed from insignificance or disposability. But this is unacceptable. Nietzsche just can't accept that, because it's a contradiction with this idea that we, humanity, are the necessary component of all reality. Nietzsche's fundamental axiom, his task is to justify and exalt our lives within this human reality. And he cannot take the view that might be synonymous with the view of the new atheists that, we live in this objective reality, and we might have our subjective perceptions, but there is an objective reality out there in which humanity is ultimately insignificant. Nietzsche doesn't want to accept that answer. And so we have this clearer picture of the problem, but only a vague idea of what the solution could be, some leap of nature, the elevation of mankind. And he says it's through the highest specimens. And so you might be familiar with the later idea of the overman. Sometimes this is translated as the Superman comes from the word Übermensch. But at this point in Nietzsche's career, that idea was not really formed yet. And neither was the will to power really formulated as a principle. So Nietzsche is still kind of feeling his way towards these concepts. But here he employs the idea instead of man in general being this sort of thing in between the blind animal world and what he calls true man, the no longer animal man. We have this potentiality within us to be elevated, but all of the activity of mankind, it does not seem to account for or attest to any such elevation. So he writes, continuing in the same passage I read from just a moment or so ago, quote, "But there are moments when we do know, and then the clouds break and we see how, with the rest of nature, we are straining towards the man, as to something that stands high above us. We look round and behind us, and fear the sudden rush of light. The beasts are transfigured, and ourselves with them. The enormous migrations of mankind in the wildernesses of the world, the cities they found, and the wars they wage, their ceaseless gatherings and dispersions and fusions, the doctrines they blindly follow, their mutual frauds and deceits, the cry of distress, the shriek of victory, are all a continuation of the beast in us. As if the education of man has been intentionally set back and his promise of self-consciousness frustrated, as if, in fact, after yearning for man so long and at last reaching him by her labor, nature should now recoil from him and wish to return to a state of unconscious instinct. Ah, she has need of knowledge and shrinks before the very knowledge she needs. The flame flickers unsteadily and fears its own brightness, and takes hold of 1,000 things before the one thing for which knowledge is necessary." End quote. This is a view of history as non-progressive, insofar as all the political activity and the struggles he references, the wars man waged, the nations and cities that mankind founds, the ideologies we follow, our defeats and successes, these don't aggregate into any kind of progress. These are still explainable purely with reference to our animal instincts, which, we're familiar with by now. If you're just now joining us, you can check out episode 9, Wisdom of the Body, where we get into Nietzschean proto-psychology, or you could even call it anti-psychology. It's Nietzsche's theory concerning physiological drives being the explanatory mechanism behind mankind's actions and behaviors. And so acting by following one's unconscious drives is fundamentally still the beast within us, acting. As Nietzsche says, if consciousness is this post hoc rationalization for why we do what we do, even though the real prime mover is not in the consciousness, as is popularly believed, that means the mind will then represent its own actions to itself in ways that launder out the fundamental amorality or even the immorality of those drives and desires, and often into something that we can persuade ourselves is respectable. And so Nietzsche would argue that people do this all the time. Even the most apparently selfless actions are rooted in some deep, selfishness, an attempt to gain self-advantage. In short, we perceive that the potential exists within mankind to become something that is not purely the blind, willing impulses. This is also, as we discussed, Schopenhauer's same project. Man has a teleological end in Schopenhauer's work as the being that can fully perceive the suffering of the world and thus, is capable of turning the will against itself and negating the will. Man is, similarly in Schopenhauer's work, the zenith of nature, the ends toward which nature itself is aimed. And importantly, Schopenhauer rejected the world morally. He rejected it. He repudiated it and ultimately held a profoundly pessimistic attitude towards life. And so you might, I bring this up because you might say that, well, hasn't Schopenhauer solved the issue of what the teleological end for man shall be, and how we'll make that qualitative leap. But Nietzsche can't accept Schopenhauer's answer because he denies the world rather than affirming it. And so Nietzsche's attention in this essay turns to culture, and that, in a very vague sense, approximates Nietzsche's answer to this problem. He writes in his notes that culture is an improved physis here meaning nature. Nietzsche's meaning is that mankind has an animal nature, but through culture man acquires a new nature, a human nature. And so perhaps that's how we get this leap, but that leaves him with the issue of explaining what culture is and defining it. The work of man, elevating man, is supposed to be carried out by culture. We can at least give a account of what that would be based on the problem. It would be to call out that potentiality within every person to become that which is truly human and something which is no longer animal, to pull people closer to that ideal by whatever measure. And so Nietzsche writes in part 6, quote, "For the problem is, in what way may your life, the individual life, retain the highest value and the deepest significance, and how may it least be squandered? Only by your living for the good of the rarest and most valuable types, not for that of the majority, who are the most worthless types taken as individuals. This way of thinking should be implanted and fostered in every young man's mind. He should regard himself both as a failure of nature's handiwork and as a testimony to her larger ideas. She has succeeded badly, he should say, but I will do honor to her great idea by being a means to its better success. With these thoughts, he will enter the circle of culture, which is the child of every man's self-knowledge and dissatisfaction. He will approach and say aloud, 'I see something above me, higher and more human than I. Let all help me to reach it, as I will help all who know and suffer as I do, that the man may arise, at last, who feels his knowledge and love, vision and power to be complete and boundless, who in his universality is one with nature, the critic and judge of existence.'" End quote. So this is a rather Herculean task, but I think he gives a fairly comprehensible account of what he sees the role of culture as being and what problem it's solving. But Nietzsche doesn't believe that culture is up to the task, to the Herculean task that's been set before it, at least not in the state he perceives it at the time of writing the essay. And this is because for Nietzsche, the fruit of culture is those highest specimens, as we've said before. This is the end which culture serves, and it's also through those outstanding individuals that culture is continued and propagated. For Nietzsche, everything in the current state of German culture seems aligned. If anything, it's aligned against producing great individuals. This is partially due to the moral ideas as Nietzsche lays them out. Culture requires sacrifice, as it is sort of hinted at in the passage above. One has to not simply consider one's own good, but the good of some higher ideal. Where we find this higher ideal lacking, sacrifice becomes difficult, if not impossible, to inspire people to undertake. In a strictly hedonistic or self-interest-driven system, sacrificing oneself, or sacrificing even any aspect of oneself, for the sake of a higher ideal becomes impossible. And, so then, when people are willing to make sacrifices in such a system, it's for themselves. It's just sort of sacrificing short-term gains, maybe for a long-term self-advantage, or maybe for their own immediate family, or it's for a parasitical higher ideal, such as the state, or the good of the greatest many. Nietzsche would see that as also a sort of parasitical ideal. The prospect of our own self-sacrifice for the sake of an individual leaves a bad taste in one's mouth, in our mouths as modern people. And so Nietzsche recognizes how the zeitgeist is moving against the ideal that he sees as the true aim of all culture. So he writes in part 4 of the essay, quote, "How does the philosopher of our time regard culture? Quite differently, I assure you, from the professors who are so content with their new state. He seems to see the symptoms of an absolute uprooting of culture in the increasing rush and hurry of life and the decay of all reflection and simplicity. The waters of religion are ebbing and leaving swamps or stagnant pools. The nations are drawing away in enmity again and long to tear each other in pieces. The sciences, blindly driving along on a laissez-faire system without a common standard, are splitting up and losing hold of every firm principle. The educated classes are being swept along in the contemptible struggle for wealth. Never was the world more worldly, never poorer in goodness and love. Men of learning are no longer beacons or sanctuaries in the midst of this turmoil of worldliness. They themselves are daily becoming more restless, thoughtless, loveless. Everything bows before the coming barbarism, art and science included. The educated men have degenerated into the greatest foes of education, for they will deny the universal sickness and hinder the physician. They become peevish, these poor, nerveless creatures, if one speak of their weakness, and combat the shameful spirit of lies in them." End quote. You may notice the disdain there for Nietzsche's contemporary scholar. Nietzsche, in this essay, criticizes the scholars very explicitly and in painstaking detail. Specifically, he criticizes the type of intellectual we would call a savant, a person with a great deal of technical knowledge or comprehensive knowledge of a given scientific or academic subject. He opposes this image of the intellectual to the idea of genius. Nietzsche here means genius in roughly the sense Schopenhauer talked about, as someone who is seized as though from without by an inspired thought or an inspired sensation or bursts of talent or productivity. The person for whom truths are inspired or revealed rather than learned by rote, as, the savant gains his wisdom. In this contrast, we have the implied answer for Nietzsche's searching for a leap of nature within mankind. It's ingenious, working through the most exceptional individuals that we get the productions of culture. The culture produced by these great individuals provides mankind with the revelation of its potential for being something other than the animal. The example of these figures of genius, therefore, is educative because it reveals knowledge to us that can motivate action, that we can find the examples of great figures instructive and thus become cultured ourselves. Again, there's so much in us that is still beast, and this is what it means to be human, all too human, or perhaps not human enough, depending on which perspective one is looking at the issue from. He finds this contrast, to the dubious cultural backdrop of Germany in the character of Schopenhauer himself. This is because of what Schopenhauer represented. He was an antipode to the current age, a solitary figure who defined his own truths and demanded them without any concern for popularity or profit. In this sense, Nietzsche's view of Schopenhauer's life can be compared to Nietzsche's view of Heraclitus. Both men were known for being solitary, not just in their way of life, but in their opinions. Heraclitus wrote that, for example, that war is the father of all, and strife is justice. Schopenhauer writes that the world is an endlessly striving will that's forever suffering. These were not popular representations of the world. And so both Heraclitus and Schopenhauer became, for Nietzsche, two different aspects of the same timeless symbol, the solitary thinker. And that is what is indicated for Nietzsche by one of those quote-unquote great people. In each of them, one perceives not simply a person, but an archetype, a timeless, comprehensive symbol. And this is what it means to say that both men are examples of genius for Nietzsche. He describes in great detail at the beginning of the work how he values Schopenhauer's honesty, his joyfulness, how he could write of such seemingly tragic and terrifying truths with such good humor. He writes of Schopenhauer's isolation. He imagines the effect that this must have had upon him and the loneliness of the thinker who doubts every truth, rejects everything that comes from outside, and dares to assert himself independently, standing only on the truths he has discovered or created on his own. But it's in section 3 where we get, in my opinion, the most profound explanation of what Schopenhauer's own archetype, what his own timeless symbol represents to Nietzsche. And so, quote, "Here we see, as I said, the greatness of Schopenhauer, that he follows up every idea as Hamlet follows the ghost, without allowing himself to turn aside for a learned digression or be drawn away by the scholastic abstractions of a rabid dialectic. The study of the minute philosophers is only interesting for the recognition that they have reached those stages in the great edifice of philosophy where learned disquisitions for and against, where hair-splitting objections and counter-objections are the rule, and for that reason they evade the demand of every great philosophy to speak sub specie aeternitatis. This is the picture of the whole of life. Learn thence the meaning of thine own life. And the converse, read thine own life, and understand thence the hieroglyphs of the universal life. In this way must Schopenhauer's philosophy always be interpreted, as an individualist philosophy, starting from the single man and his own nature to gain an insight into his personal miseries and needs and limitations, and find out the remedies that will console them, namely, the sacrifice of the ego and its submission to the nobler ends, especially those of justice and mercy. He teaches us to distinguish between the true and the apparent furtherance of man's happiness, how neither the attainment of riches, nor honor, nor learning can raise the individual from his deep despair at his unworthiness, and how the quest for these good things can only have meaning through a universal end that transcends and explains them, the gaining of power to aid our physical nature by them, and as far as may be, correct its folly and awkwardness. For oneself only, in the first instance, and finally through oneself for all, it is a task that leads to skepticism, for there is so much to be made better yet in one and all." End quote. There's so much to be made better yet. Just emphasizing again the significance of Schopenhauer is in potential for the elevation of mankind that exists in the example that he sets. This is the example set by his honesty, his loyalty to his own intuition, his faith in himself, his skepticism, his rejection of the pursuit of honors, wealth, or titles. And so we have this, I think that's, all of those things contrast Schopenhauer with the savant, the genius against the savant. The genius is the rare specimen through whom this inexplicable greatness flows, and that's the realization of man's potential for a human nature. The savant, meanwhile, does not elevate nature. Nietzsche actually says, the savant wants to kill nature by analyzing it to death, by being a servant of cold, calculating knowledge without any relation to life. The academic intellectuals do not rely on genius. They rely on an agreed upon set of methods and doctrines. And, they're servants of truth, as Nietzsche calls them, but he calls them that in a disparaging way. He also calls them vivisectors of the natural world rather than students of it. They're concerned with status, social acceptance, and money. They see knowledge as this detached and disinterested thing. They do not see into the depths. Those are among all the criticisms against the savant, or the mere scholar, we might say. And that section goes on, actually, for a very long time, with Nietzsche listing think 12 or 13 different things that he finds wrong with the scholars. The key difference between a higher culture and a lower culture within an individual or society, Nietzsche thinks, relates to the timeliness of that culture's perspective and aims. So in our society today, everything is current. Our perspective is aimed at what is most immediate, satisfying the most immediate desires and aims. Nietzsche had a similar diagnosis of his own culture. He says that, however, this is a sign of an empty or a hollow culture, because true culture necessarily involves the ability to cast one's gaze far and away. To be culture is to consider these timeless symbols of genius, for example, or to cast one's gaze into the distant future, or to a higher ideal, or infinitely back into the past, following the great chain of being, of one's ancestors that you're a part of. Deep cultures have an eye that looks to farther horizons. Our empty cultures just look to what's right in front of them, which is not too dissimilar to how animals behave, yet again. Our society is obsessed with money. Nietzsche points out a common etymological root between currency and current, as in, current and in the moment. And how, the business world and the pursuit of material wealth is puts you into a short-term mindset in many respects. Nietzsche levies the charge that there are several forms of parasitical culture that have taken root in European society. He warns his reader not to mistake these new types of individuals for an ideal. The types he lists are the businessman, the worshiper of the state, the person who is obsessed with the outward forms of culture, such as etiquette, and finally the savants, the intellectuals who exist within the academic institutions. All of these types have something in common. They have no higher task or higher ideal to which they aim outside of their immediate self-preservative aims, or aims which serve the status quo in some fashion. As such, Nietzsche believes that all of these cultural types that we have produced, that we just listed off, they all actually hinder the emergence of genius. So, for example, the type of the businessman, which is alive and well today, as a respected role for someone to fill, and a role that many aspire to fill. The businessman only needs enough education to do business and to make money. That's the only role that education serves for the businessman. Nietzsche has, again, very comprehensive, much broader and deeper meaning for the word education. He doesn't just mean, education in the things we would get in a normal course in a public school. He means education for life, life lessons as well. But whether we're talking about education in terms of book learning or practical knowledge or life lessons or whatever, the only role that education serves for the businessman is helping him make money. Ultimately, his work in life is the same task of resource acquisition and defense and all of that animals engage in, done from the goal of rational self-interest, fulfillment of the most immediate self-advantageous desires, in a word, hedonism. Even when there's self-sacrifice or long-term goals, it's for self-advantage, for no other means than simply acquiring. The person of etiquette, we might call them like the false person of culture, who's obsessed with the outward forms of culture, will use things like high art as yet another veil or accessory for their own self-presentation. But this doesn't have anything to do with elevating or raising up mankind or to any horizons beyond oneself. It's simply vanity. And so this type of person is also a parasite on culture. The state also has no conception of a cultural end higher than itself. In spite of the fact that culture may be fostered by the state, in some cases, culture is never the end of the state. The state just seeks to preserve itself and to entrench its power. The state, by that token, is, it's not an end in the proper order of things. The state is only a means of preserving and fostering a culture, in Nietzsche's view. If the culture turns and becomes the servant of the state, or synonymous with the orthodoxies of the state, then genius becomes hindered yet again. In Nietzsche's words criticizing the state here, we do get some indication from Nietzsche that he's grappling with the death of God already, so to speak, because he sees indications that the state is one vessel into which people are pouring their same devotion they once showed to God. This is it's almost as like a counterbalancing response to the constantly increasing atomization of society and culture. That, splitting up and having less of a broad societal fabric or broad understanding of the sacred that everyone agrees with. And so Nietzsche writes, quote, "We live in the atomic age, or rather in the atomic chaos. The opposing forces were practically held together in medieval times by the church, and in some measure assimilated by the strong pressure which she exerted. When the common tie broke and the pressure relaxed, they rose once more against each other. The Reformation taught that many things were adiaphora, departments that needed no guidance from religion. This was the price paid for its own existence. Christianity paid a similar one to guard itself against the far more religious antiquity, and laid the seeds of discord at once. Everything nowadays is directed by the fools and the knaves, the selfishness of the money-makers and the brute forces of militarism. The state in their hands makes a good show of reorganizing everything and of becoming the bond that unites the warring elements. In other words, it wishes for the same idolatry from mankind as they showed to the church." End quote. And some of the language there may remind you of some of the passages that made their way into Zarathustra. Finally, after his criticism of the state and the state's worshippers, we have the fourth type, which he lists, which we've already discussed to some degree, which is the academic. The self-interested person who uses the pursuit of knowledge as a means of advancing themselves and advancing within the liberal institutions. So Nietzsche writes in part 6, quote, "All four are emulously thinking how they can benefit themselves with the help of culture, but have no thoughts at all when their own interests are not engaged. And so they have done nothing to improve the conditions for the birth of genius in modern times. And the opposition to original men has grown so far that no Socrates could ever live among us, and certainly could never reach the age of 70. End quote. So, we sometimes look down on the Athenians for poisoning Socrates, right? Nietzsche is suggesting that perhaps in contemporary Germany, a Socrates would have met a similar fate, and perhaps his own society might even be more intolerant to such a figure as Socrates than even the Greeks were, and we could certainly apply that criticism to ourselves today. What I love about this essay is how it contains some of Nietzsche's own soul-searching about himself and his place within the academy. Because remember, while he's here criticizing scholars and savants, he is still himself teaching at Basel. And he actually writes in this very essay, to complain of the intellectual limitations put upon the university professor, how one is essentially paid for the use of one's mind, but how one must always be willing to lecture at the appointed time and on the appointed topics, and how one must produce work which adheres to the agreed-upon standards of the institution, and so on. How all this inhibits the free flow of thought done as an activity of genius here, rather than, an activity of technical knowledge. And Nietzsche, you can tell, is wondering, can I really pursue philosophy as a life path within the academy itself? And of course, we all know the answer he comes to, that eventually, when his illness got bad enough, he quit teaching. And then, of course, he went and found the independence he felt he needed to truly become a philosopher. And there's a letter, I think, from the mid-1880s. He made some remark to a friend about being, addressed by someone as Professor Friedrich Nietzsche. And he asked, what does that old academic have to do with me? The way Nietzsche might have conceived of his personal journey would be as a transition from the role of the mere intellectual or mere scholar into inhabiting the archetype of the philosopher, transforming into a new type of person. you know. And so, educated as he was by the example of Schopenhauer, Nietzsche becomes elevated, right? This is Nietzsche becoming who he is, to put it again in the language of his own philosophy. And so he writes in the very first part of this essay, Schopenhauer as Educator, in language prefiguring that famous dictum of Nietzsche's. Quote, "If the great thinker despises mankind, it is for their laziness. They seem mere indifferent bits of pottery, not worth any commerce or improvement. The man who will not belong to the general mass has only to stop taking himself easily, to follow his conscience, which cries out to him, 'Be thyself. All that thou doest and thinkest and desirest is not thyself.'" End quote. And so he writes in that section about how an untimely person should regard his untimeliness with a bit of gratitude, with the counterexample of his culture he finds himself surrounded by. He can more thoroughly distinguish himself as an individual, because being an individual is knowing yourself to be different. You know, we know things in some sense by contrast. And so that's a blessing in a sense to find oneself untimely, because that is the gateway to becoming an individual. The way he develops this, all these considerations though, and where this is moving towards, we should bring up, there's a parallel idea, funnily enough, between Nietzsche and Hegel. Hegel divided absolute mind, which is reality in the purest form, completely undistorted rational perception of the truth. He divided that into three different expressions: philosophy, art, and religion. Philosophy, in Hegel's view, was superior to art or aesthetics and to religion, because philosophy is the purest expression of absolute mind. Philosophy uses universal concepts to reveal the truth of reality. Nietzsche, he uses the same divisions, you might say, as he phrases it in more concrete terms than Hegel does. He's not speaking of the abstraction of the discipline or the practice of philosophy, art, and religion, but he talks about the type of person. And so for Nietzsche, he lists the three types of individuals who arise from the human species as an expression of genius. And that is the saint, the artist, and the philosopher. So the saint standing for religion, art obviously corresponds to artist, and philosopher to philosophy. So interesting parallel there between Nietzsche and Hegel, one which I think is intentional. Rather than standing for people discovering disciplines which reveal an absolute truth, however, these figures, through their expression of genius, represent nature's leap from the animal world into the truly human. It's something qualitatively different from the animals. What has concerned Nietzsche throughout this inquiry is essentially a question of values that Nietzsche must solve within the limitations that he's already, rejected many previous explanations of what the grounding of our value system is. And so this is an attempt at answering that question. The transcendent value of mankind is in the fact that we produce artists, saints, and philosophers. And so he writes in part 5, quote, "The sincere men who have cast out the beast, the philosophers, artists, and saints, nature, quae nunquam facit saltum, has made her one leap in creating them, a leap of joy, as she feels herself for the first time at her goal." End quote. And skipping further down in the passage, quote, "Nature needs the artist, as she needs the philosopher, for a metaphysical end, the explanation of herself, whereby she may have a clear and sharp picture of what she only saw dimly in the troubled period of transition, and so may reach self-consciousness." Goethe, in an arrogant yet profound phrase, showed how all nature's attempts only have value insofar as the artist interprets her stammering words, meets her halfway, and speaks aloud what she really means. "I have often said, and will often repeat," he exclaims in one place, "the causa finalis of natural and human activity is in dramatic poetry. Otherwise, the stuff is of no use at all." Finally, nature needs the saint. In him, the ego has melted away, and the suffering of his life is, practically, no longer felt as individual, but as the spring of the deepest sympathy and intimacy with all living creatures. He sees the wonderful transformation scene that the comedy of becoming never reaches, the attainment at length of the high state of man after which all nature is striving, that she may be delivered from herself. Without doubt, we all stand in close relation to him, as well as to the philosopher and the artist. There are moments, sparks from the clear fire of love, in whose light we understand the word I no longer. There is something beyond our being that comes, for those moments, to the hither side of it, and this is why we long in our hearts for a bridge from here to there." End quote. Consider the contrast between these three figures we've just examine, the philosopher, artist, and saint, to the four types of, like, the parasitical cultural figure that we discussed before. Those figures, the businessman, the pretentious purveyor of high culture, the scholar, and the partisan, or the lover of the state. These are all concerned with what is current, immediate, near at hand, with preservation of the government, or of their status, or their material well-being, or their reputation, or with vanity. It's all hedonistic, utilitarian, nearsighted. It's completely contrary to what a culture needs if it's going to continue itself, because culture is continued on by the rare productions of genius within it, rather than some accumulation of technical progress over the years. What you need for that is far-sightedness, and the willingness for oneself to be a bridge and not a goal, which means one needs a worthy ideal. The artist, the saint, and the philosopher all make the way for that ideal, or bring that ideal into sharper focus. They make the representation of the ideal possible. Through various means, they open man's eyes to the possibility of self-overcoming. And then you suddenly have the possibility of perceiving things like beauty, experiencing things like love, undergoing self-discipline, something impossible for a mere animal. Man becomes qualitatively different for Nietzsche in terms which are both practical and intuitively easy to understand, but also beguile simple explanations, such as the ideas of beauty, truth, love, and so on. And in any case, Nietzsche says that nature makes the leap at the moment whenever art, religion, and philosophy come into the world and through the genius of these great figures. Now, what's interesting is that as Nietzsche's work continues and his thought continues to develop, he obviously he has a great deal of criticism for all three of these types of figures. The saint is obviously criticized, while he's the ideal of self-discipline and asceticism, sort of represented, and he achieves this great self-discipline in the Christian tradition through directing, Nietzsche says the saint directs his resentful cruelty within himself and tyrannizes and torments himself in this constant battle with his insatiable desires. And so the saint developed an unhealthy mind-body dualism in Europe, an unhealthy relationship towards the passions, of a tendency to emasculate the passions. If thy eye offends thee, pluck it out. The artist is criticized too by Nietzsche because art is by its nature a form of deception and borrows from the power of religion for world enchanting. Art, it can stir religious feelings, regardless of whether one has, quote, lost the habit of religion or not. And then finally, Nietzsche would criticize philosophers as prone to universalizing truths which are only, in actuality, provisional or perspectival, we might say. And Nietzsche criticizes philosophers as being largely unaware that their abstract ideas are merely the confession of their own moral or immoral ends. And so we shouldn't misunderstand his characterization of these three types of genius as meaning these people are inherently good or praiseworthy. What's important is the type and what we can learn from that type, what that type, the function that it serves, rather than the praise of any one individual of the type. And so there's one final aspect of this essay, or a final dimension of it, that is incredibly important, that it also involves Schopenhauer, and it's Nietzsche's use of three examples of people who provide an image of the truly human being, an image of the true man to strive after. An image of man is the way he simply puts it. Rather than just speaking in general terms of artists, philosophers, and saints, we have to remember Nietzsche's not, he does give them a classification in some sense, but he's not actually really talking about classes or groups of people here, or at least that's not the way you should think about it. Remember, these are all archetypal individuals, and Nietzsche is talking about the philosopher as a higher type, so he takes care to distinguish that person from the savant, for example, or the scholar, the person simply studying the discipline of philosophy. And so what he means when he's talking about philosophers as a group, he means people whose names we all know: Socrates, Heraclitus, Plato, Voltaire, Schopenhauer. When he speaks of the type of the artist, he doesn't mean somebody who went to art school, or a poser making modern popular art. He means Michelangelo, he means Shakespeare, he means Goethe. And so in this spirit, Nietzsche gets more specific. He offers three figures, two of which we've already mentioned in the course of the essay, but the three figures which he thinks can provide an image or an ideal to the contemporary age. And so, of course, Nietzsche speaking about his own age. It's not entirely clear that these figures can help us in the here and now because of that. But because these three figures stand for a timeless symbol of a certain way of living, I think the thinking is that we can extract a general lesson from the examples he chooses. And so this is from part 4. Quote, "There are three images of man fashioned by our modern time, which for a long while yet will urge mortal men to transfigure their own lives. They are the men of Rousseau, Goethe, and Schopenhauer. The first has the greatest fire, and is most calculated to impress the people. The second is only for the few, for those contemplative natures in the grand style who are misunderstood by the crowd. The third demands the highest activity in those who follow it. Only such men will look on that image without harm, for it breaks the spirit of that merely contemplative man, and the rabble shudder at it." End quote. From the selection that Nietzsche chooses, I think we can make a compelling argument he's working within the cultural milieu of Romanticism. Romanticism, as I've mentioned before, is a very tricky word, and again, I promise we're going to delve more into what this word means in this context, but we're going to do that next week because it's more relevant to the episode. But for our purposes, Romanticism is a movement in art, culture, literature beginning in the late 1700s, most of the early and mid-1800s, and with an influence lingering well even into our modern times. For our purposes here, I will define Romanticism in sociological terms. As that movement, we can understand the broad strokes of Romanticism as a reaction to the Industrial Revolution, the rise of the nation-state, the emergence of democratic institutions, and all the increasingly complex social systems that served to ferry mankind ever further from his connection to the natural world and increasingly made the individual seem insignificant. The individual is overwhelmed by, for example, economic systems based on mass production, where machines produce roughly identical goods, and the skills and creativity of the individual, it's no longer relevant. The craftsman is only relevant insofar as he's producing boutique goods. The individual is overwhelmed in the political realm by mass political movements with the increasing power of the state, which imposes the will of the greatest number upon the whole of society. And so Nietzsche himself has been characterized as a romantic during this period, because a common thread among romantic thought is the idealization of a storied or idyllic past, the desire to return to a closer communion with nature. He also shares romantic suspicion about progress. Romanticism is untimely, just as Nietzsche is. And the romantic is compelled to ask what 10 more years could bring us that the last 10 have not already. And, great individuals or great societies can emerge at any time if the conditions are correct. The conditions don't necessarily improve with the passage of time in Nietzsche's view and in the view of the Romantics. In fact, Nietzsche is perhaps most clearly romantic. insofar as he regards the Greek culture as superior to the German culture of the 1870s. Effectively the claim that a culture 3,000 years ago achieved a higher, zenith, that completely flies in the face of any idea of cumulative progress. And so the untimeliness of Nietzsche can be interpreted as this allegiance with romantic thought. But things are always a bit more complicated with Nietzsche, and so we can't just simply call him a romantic and have done with it. The reason for this allegiance, as I put it, is that he perceives a common spirit with them in their untimeliness, and Nietzsche sees, I think, that this is perhaps the opportunity to rouse some potential free spirits from their dogmatic slumber. He perceives this romantic zeitgeist in Germany and in Europe more broadly. He sees how, depending on which image of man people follow, they can be molded into a different image. All the three figures he lists are arguably romantic figures, but Nietzsche's distinguishing them shows he doesn't regard it all as being essentially the same thing, but they all stand for different timeless symbols of genius. And in fact, he actually has condemnation for the first figure, Rousseau, admiration for the second, which is Goethe, and praise for the third, which is Schopenhauer. And so his own personal evaluation of these three men, these three ideals, varies widely. But the fact is that each is arguably a romantic in his own way. It reveals that not that Nietzsche can simply be put in this conceptual box of romanticism, but rather that Nietzsche saw the power of romanticism and the fact that within it was the potential to push the zeitgeist in one direction or another. And again, I should make clear, I'm speaking here about early Nietzsche. Nietzsche at the time of writing this essay is often described in these terms, and I think accurately. And so the first figure is Rousseau. Rousseau famously wrote of civilization as founded upon injustices and the current state of society, the current distribution of wealth and power. It's a result of these past injustices. The classic contrast is between the view of Hobbes versus the view of Rousseau. Hobbes said that life in the state of nature was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Hobbes's argument was that the state served a function as Leviathan, the enforcer of morality which deters the subjects from committing injustices, whereas Rousseau, meanwhile, was less optimistic about the state and more optimistic about the state of nature. For Hobbes, the state creates justice. For Rousseau, it destroys it. Rousseau believed that smaller, more localized governments managed through direct democratic participation of the people were not only feasible, but also more moral than, the hierarchical rule under these large states. And so Nietzsche writes, quote, "From the first has come forth a strength that led and still leads to fearful revolution. For in all socialistic upheavals it is ever Rousseau's man who is the typhus under the Etna. Oppressed and half-crushed to death by the pride of caste and the pitilessness of wealth, spoilt by priests and bad education, a laughingstock even to himself, man cries in his need on Holy Mother Nature, and feels suddenly that she is as far from him as any god of the Epicureans. His prayers do not reach her, so deeply sunk as he is in the chaos of the unnatural. He contemptuously throws aside all the finery that seemed his truest humanity a little while ago, all his arts and sciences, all the refinements of his life. He beats with his fists against the walls, in whose shadow he has degenerated, and goes forth to seek the light and the sun, the forest and the crag. And crying out, 'Nature alone is good, the natural man alone is human,' he despises himself and aspires beyond himself, a state wherein the soul is ready for a fearful resolve, but calls the noble and the rare as well from their utter depths." End quote. And so this is a psychological assessment of the type of person who will be compelled by Rousseau. It's Nietzsche's assessment of where that longing for nature comes from, and another hint that the decline of religiosity is partially responsible for revolutionary upheavals. What's interesting, this is a very old kind of anti-revolutionary stance. Nietzsche doesn't criticize revolutionaries as, say, a conservative today might do, by suggesting that the would-be revolutionaries only want power, or reminding people of the tyrannical state that communist governments created. No, Nietzsche's pointing out the revolutionaries are driven in actual fact by a conviction in the natural goodness of mankind and yearning to commune with something of nature once again, believing that justice can be found in absentia of civilization and thus desiring to tear the civilization down so that justice can flourish. Now, the astute among you might point out that Nietzsche would actually probably agree that a revolutionary's actions are part of a struggle for power because all human motivation is ultimately driven by will for power. However, it must be said that Nietzsche hadn't fully conceived of will to power at this point, yet again, and it should further be noted that will to power is not intended as a doctrine to reduce everything to a vulgar, simplistic, disingenuous power struggle. The underlying factor here that's explanatory is the death of God and the desire for man to commune with something beyond himself and recreate himself in a new ideal that is closer to nature. And so the image of man that Rousseau provides is mankind relocating that highest ideal within the natural world. The natural world has become something which is beyond the modern man because the modern life is so far removed from nature and so overwhelmed with complexity and all those individuality-crushing forces. And so that's the degree that it's driven by power, the power to recreate oneself and to return with this, to reach this higher ideal, which is the return to nature. Nietzsche warns that revolutionaries can become like Catiline, who was a Roman senator who was accused of fomenting a plot to destroy the Roman Republic, of being a revolutionary. He was famously tried by the Senate with Cicero as his prosecutor. He also compares the revolutionary type to the monster of Greek myths, Typhon, who's responsible for all the eruptions of Mount Etna. Typhon's also known as the father of all monsters. And so, in a metaphorical language, what Nietzsche thinks about the danger of revolutionary attitudes is clear, but the revolutionary aims for something beyond himself. He aims for the elevation of mankind, and in his paradoxical way, by making the conscious decision to will a return to nature as an act of liberation from injustice. And so the timeless idea of Rousseau is the romantic as revolutionary. And Rousseau forms an image for man that is powerful, and that Nietzsche must acknowledge as a viable means of aiming beyond oneself, aiming for a new transformation in the course of becoming, and thus for conquering the beast within man. The next example he gives is Goethe. I'm going to quote from what he says about Goethe in an abridged form in the interest of time, even though it's still a long quote. All right, quote, Goethe's man, in a certain sense, is a corrective and a sedative to those dangerous agitations of which Rousseau's man is prey. Goethe himself in his youth followed the gospel of kindly nature with all the ardor of his soul. His Faust was the highest and boldest picture of Rousseau's man, so far at any rate as his hunger for life, his discontent and yearning, his intercourse with the demons of his heart could be represented. Here begins the new image of man according to Goethe. One might have thought that Faust would have lived a continual life of suffering as a revolutionary and a deliverer. One is wrong, however, to expect anything of the sort. Goethe's man here parts company with Rousseau's, for he hates all violence, all sudden transition, that is, all action, and the universal deliverer becomes merely the universal traveler. All the riches of life and nature, all antiquity, arts, mythologies, and sciences pass before his eager eyes, his deepest desires aroused and satisfied. At a fair spot on the earth, when his flight comes to an end, his pinions drop, and Mephistopheles is at his side. When the German ceases to be Faust, there is no greater danger than becoming a Philistine and falling into the hands of the devil. Heavenly powers alone can save him. Goethe's man is, as I said, the contemplative man in the grand style, who is only kept from dying of ennui by feeding on all the great and memorable things that have ever existed, and by living from desire to desire. He is not the active man, and when he does take a place among active men, as things are, you may be sure that no good will come of it. Goethe's man is a conciliatory and conservative spirit, though in danger of degenerating into a Philistine, just as Rousseau's man may easily become a Catiline." End quote. And so you may have noticed something in these first two descriptions of Rousseau contrasted with Goethe, especially if you know of Nietzsche's argument in Birth of Tragedy concerning the two artistic forces of Apollo and Dionysus. Here, Rousseau is actually very close to Dionysus as he's portrayed in Birth of Tragedy, which is not necessarily the same thing Nietzsche meant by Dionysus when he would use the metaphor of Dionysus in his later work. But in this era, anyway, Rousseau he's yearning to undo the primordial pain and contradiction of being a human being so we can return to this primal oneness with nature. In the state of nature, all these boundary stones are upheaved. The slave is a free man. All feast equally as they do, as animals do on the bounty of the earth. All are equally provided for. That's the aim of the Rousseau man. Goethe is closer to Apollo. Goethe's image of man, it's one of the life lived for knowledge, for experience, for learning. Goethe's man is represented as more neutral, as perceiving and representing from a more dispassionate perspective. The image of Goethe as given here is also, it's very commensurate with Schopenhauer's idea of the artistic genius, the person who loses himself in the representation of the world, in all the world's tragedy and violence and burning desire and unfulfilled passion. Goethe as the will-less subject of knowing, it can become that mirror for the world. The artist comes in and renders it in archetypal form, allowing us to contemplate being in this more, in a higher sense. And that's what the image of Goethe offers. He's the romantic contemplative, held up opposed to the revolutionary. And so naturally, Goethe's archetype is more for the few than for the many, like Rousseau's man. But Nietzsche also admits what Goethe is lacking, and that's capacity for action, for strong feeling. In a word, he's lacking in passion. He's always in danger of becoming a Philistine, which means slipping out of a state of culturation and into barbarism. And accordingly, Goethe himself had a great respect for what he called the non-theoretical man, the man of action, whom he said the best example of was Napoleon. But Goethe himself is not such a person, and so he respects the man of action so much because as a man of letters, he finds such qualities lacking. But again, Goethe's man looks beyond himself. He is not satisfied with life as it is, just as Faust was not satisfied, and is ever searching for a zenith to human happiness and knowledge, constantly moving from experience to experience, desire to desire. Goethe, he provides another bridge to the higher man in that respect, because he's not satisfied with himself as he is. He's interested in endless transformation. But Nietzsche doesn't choose either Rousseau nor Goethe as an image of man to guide him as educator. In spite of his love for Goethe, and in spite of all his disagreement with the underlying spirit of Schopenhauer, Nietzsche holds up Schopenhauer's image as the ideal for himself, and the ideal which he offers the reader. Schopenhauer is the romantic hero. This is his archetype, contrasted with the romantic revolutionary and the romantic contemplative. And so he writes of Schopenhauer's type, quote, "Everything that can be denied deserves to be denied, and real sincerity means the belief in a state of things which cannot be denied, or in which there is no lie. The sincere man feels that his activity has a metaphysical meaning. It can only be explained by the laws of a different and a higher life. It is in the deepest sense an affirmation, even if everything that he does seem utterly opposed to the laws of our present life. It must lead, therefore, to constant suffering, but he knows, as Meister Eckhart did, that the quickest beast that will carry you to perfection is suffering. Everyone, I should think, who has such an ideal before him must feel a wider sympathy, and he will have a burning desire to become a Schopenhauer man, pure and wonderfully patient, on his intellectual side, full of a devouring fire, and far removed from the cold and contemptuous neutrality of the so-called scientific man, so high above any warped and morose outlook on life as to offer himself as the first victim of the truth he has won, with a deep consciousness of the sufferings that must spring from his sincerity. His courage will destroy his happiness on earth. He must be an enemy to the men he loves and the institutions in which he grew up. He must spare neither person nor thing, however it may hurt him. He will be misunderstood and thought an ally of forces that he abhors. In his search for righteousness, he will seem unrighteous by human standards. But he must comfort himself with the words that his teacher Schopenhauer once used. Quote, "A happy life is impossible. The highest thing that man can aspire to is a heroic life, such as a man lives who is always fighting against unequal odds for the good of others, and wins in the end without any thanks." End quote. What makes Schopenhauer a heroic philosopher to Nietzsche, and thus another bridge to something beyond ourselves, is his willingness to fight against those beliefs that stir happiness, in his heroic honesty. Schopenhauer reveals another way beyond our current state, our current age, the current incarnation, the current transformation of man. Still as much animal as man even now, but Schopenhauer offers a way to something more closely approximating the true man, and just like the other images do, but Schopenhauer does this by attacking comfort, by fearlessly following one's intellectual conscience. If you do this, you invariably find yourself in opposition to your culture, and thus you become out of step with contemporary thought, or out of season, you might say. Through this challenge, through waging passionate war on that which was once indisputably sacred, through destroying one's own happiness even, and even through knowing that one will be misunderstood through all of this, Schopenhauer shows the way of the solitary hero, carving out the most individual of paths, the path requiring the most grit and toughness in some sense. And this is the model that Nietzsche says he chose as his ideal to emulate, the Schopenhauer man. So we'll sign off after this, but I'm just going to read one more quote and close the episode with that, which I haven't done in a while. But I think it's a beautiful climactic way to end the podcast. So this is from the last paragraph of part 5 from Schopenhauer's Educator. Reading this one before signing off, and I'll see you all next week. Quote, "The heroic man does not think of his happiness or misery, his virtues or his vices, or of his being the measure of things. He has no further hopes of himself and will accept the utter consequences of his hopelessness. His strength lies in his self-forgetfulness. If he have a thought for himself, it is only to measure the vast distance between himself and his aim, and to view what he has left behind him as so much dross. The old philosophers sought for happiness and truth with all their strength, and there is an evil principle in nature, that not one shall find that which he cannot help seeking. But the man who looks for a lie in everything, and becomes a willing friend to unhappiness, shall have a marvelous disillusioning. There hovers near him something unutterable, of which truth and happiness are but idolatrous images born of the night. The earth loses her dragging weight. The events and powers of earth become as a dream, and a gradual clearness widens round him like a summer evening. It is as though the beholder of these things began to wake, and it had only been the clouds of a passing dream that had been weaving about him. They will at some time disappear, and then it will be day." End quote. So this is going to be the culmination of everything we've talked about in the past few episodes, and in some way, really throughout the entire podcast. This is the final piece of the puzzle in explaining Nietzsche's differences from Schopenhauer. But in the course of answering this question, hopefully you'll gain some insight into the central dichotomy, as I see it, that Nietzsche establishes in his work, and the central opposition with which he concerns himself. And this opposition is central here in this issue also of explaining both why Nietzsche was attracted to Schopenhauer and why he had to overcome Schopenhauer. And this opposition is stated right in the title of the episode, Dionysus versus the Crucified. The core question we started out with at the beginning of the first Schopenhauer episode was how the no-saying Schopenhauer could inspire the yes-saying Nietzsche. How does a philosopher who concludes that life is not worth living inspire the philosopher who says, not only is life worth living, it's worth living exactly the same way 1,000, 1,000,000, an endless number of times over? And so to answer this question, I've brought in with me selections mainly just from two sections of Nietzsche's work where he addresses two labels that have been applied to him and which were also applied to Schopenhauer, and these are romanticism and pessimism, which in a sense these are sort of the subtopics of the episode. But this is where Nietzsche explains in his own words how he overcame romanticism and pessimism, or rather, how he reinterpreted romanticism and pessimism, and thus took his view beyond the view of Schopenhauer, and to a lesser extent, he also talks about the views of Wagner. If we'll remember briefly, in the last episode about the essay entitled Schopenhauer as Educator, we talked about how Nietzsche saw in Schopenhauer a solitary thinker in the mold of Heraclitus, who sought for truths based on his own inner demands and his own subjective experience and rejected the contemporary wisdom, someone who rejected even, the institutional learning and the scholars. And so perhaps Schopenhauer was this inspiration for Nietzsche's leaving academia to pursue the philosophical life on his own. In that essay, Nietzsche says Schopenhauer fulfilled the role of the heroic philosopher who is willing to be an enemy to his own happiness in the pursuit of truth, and to strive endlessly toward the potential of what mankind could be. Schopenhauer leads the way to becoming a true man, a no longer animal man, because Schopenhauer wrote of a world in which man was the zenith of nature, the one being who can, represent the world as will in such a way as to make its negation possible. In other words, for man to be liberated from the blind striving that is the character of all natural beings. Nietzsche searched in the wake of Schopenhauer for this means of continuing in the heroic tradition, seeking a way by which man might be elevated beyond the world of the blindly striving will. So Nietzsche is therefore concerned with that same question of how man might be elevated. And his outlook is that for the majority of the species, as we discussed in that episode, the beast has not been cast out at all, but that most people still follow their blind impulses and simply author a conscious fiction in the wake of their deeds. But on the other hand, Nietzsche sees that there are these extraordinary types that can serve as an example to bring us closer to realizing the meaning of nature, as he puts it, and those types are the artist, saint, and philosopher. The philosopher is a higher type because by means of philosophy, the world can be represented in the form of concepts, which allows for man to use reason instead of following blind impulse. As for the artist, in, the Schopenhauerian artistic theory, for example, by means of artistic expression, we can become this clear mirror reflecting the phenomenon of the world, and so you can become this will-less subject of knowing. And finally, there's the example of the saint who shows the way through discipline and self-abnegation. And, the saint, through his asceticism, gives us the example of someone who's no longer subject to these blind impulses, yet again. But alas, following these Untimely Meditations essays in which these ideas are all put forward, Nietzsche goes on to write, as the culmination of his early philosophy, Human All Too Human, which, as the title implies, is less of a call for man to be elevated beyond the natural world, but rather it includes a tacit acceptance of the purely naturalistic origin of mankind, and the fact that even among the great specimens of mankind, Nietzsche finds the greatest among them merely human, all too human. And so this is why the problem persists for Nietzsche during this more critical period of his philosophy, which is sometimes called the Free Spirit period, or the middle period, beginning with Human All Too Human, books 1 and 2, and then The Wanderer and His Shadow, The Dawn, and finally the gay science. And during this time, we see Nietzsche's penetrating criticisms of religion, of philosophy, of the popular morality undermine all of these metaphysical claims of man's transcendent value. And that's why God is killed in the process. This period in Nietzsche's philosophy, as we went over, it culminates in the death of God, which happens in the gay science. After the death of God, all values are undermined. Nothing has transcendent value any longer. And so we have this problem in Nietzsche's philosophy then. Still, we have his desire to see mankind elevated, which means for man to become something beyond ourselves, which is so important because Nietzsche sees that as the natural and healthy thing for all living things. We have to continue becoming, continue to grow and transform. And yet, how can mankind do this? As we discussed about the Untimely Meditations period, he first considers the sincere men who have cast out the beast, the artist, the saint, and philosopher. So practically speaking, this means we look to certain figures like Plato or Goethe or Socrates or Caesar or Jesus and use their example to carry us forward. But so first of all, I'll say that that's a big reason why we would place Nietzsche as a romantic during this period, or why many people do, because this is a view of history as non-progressive. The past isn't categorically, quote-unquote, better than the present, but it's because there's not a linear progression of man's betterment that happens across time. It's not, man doesn't become better because of an collective increase in man's intellect or in technology or in social advancement. Nietzsche doesn't believe in that. And in theory, you could have quote-unquote better societies that existed 3,000 years ago just as easily as one could exist 3,000 years from now. So perhaps the zenith of culture happened a long time ago and nothing we experience will ever be as good. That's at least possible. And so in Nietzsche's view, for example, Greek culture far eclipsed the German culture of his time, and in fact eclipsed all of modernity and all European culture, or what passed for culture. And so Nietzsche is in agreement with Schopenhauer here. He believes that the great people and great cultures can happen at any time and at any age, because if we remember, Schopenhauer writes that genius, he talks about genius in much the same way that Nietzsche does. Genius is something which can strike at any point in history, in any society. So rather than casting our hopes into the future of mankind, the idea here is we would look to peoples and cultures who have already existed, because those are the examples we have access to. And the maxim to sum up this attitude, as we discussed, is in the past episode, is what could 10 or 20 more years teach us that the lives of all the great people throughout history has not already taught us? And so this creates a romantic attitude, rejection of world historical progress, looking to the past as a model for behavior, primacy of the senses and the passions, and the desire to reconcile mankind to nature, or somehow incorporate man into a naturalistic outlook on morality. And so Nietzsche, in his early period, has at least some form of agreement with all of these principles. But, of course, Nietzsche differs with Schopenhauer in what genius is, and what the goal of a person's life should ultimately be. Schopenhauer provides an example again to cast out the beast, to rise above blind willing. His aim is the negation of the will. But Nietzsche does not accept that answer. He doesn't accept the Christian answer of man's elevation over the animals either. But the tension remains because Nietzsche has this conviction. Man must be aimed at the horizon, at becoming something new, at self-overcoming. He's already committed to that conviction in his past writing that knowledge which doesn't serve life, which doesn't serve the growth into something better, is worthless. And so, just as a hint at where this is going, Nietzsche's eventual great insight is that one does not elevate man, that is, make mankind a more fully realized, more perfect expression of nature, by casting out the beast. Nietzsche holds to the idea of producing a vision of how mankind can be uplifted, but he changes his conception of what man is and how man can be lifted up. And the reason he changes this view is because it largely has to do with the conclusion of his critical period with the death of God and the realization, within his philosophical project of all that is all too human within mankind, and indeed, all that is all too human within Nietzsche's higher man. That it wasn't that Napoleon or Goethe or Caesar or Shakespeare cast out man's inner beast. No, rather they harness the power of the beast, you could put it. Another way of talking about this, of how Nietzsche eventually overcame Schopenhauer, is through the discovery of will to power. And that's something we talked about, will to power, in episode 14 extensively. But there's another way of talking about what is essentially the same discovery in terms that are a little more poetic. And that's the discovery of the Dionysian. And these are the terms Nietzsche uses in the first passage that we'll look at today. And the aphorism is called What is Romanticism? It's in the Gay Science, Book 5, aphorism 370. First, just a little more context, because Book 5 of the Gay Science was added to the edition published in 1887. So this is not written during the time the rest of the Gay Science was written. In fact, both of the passages we're looking at today are from around the same time. One is from 1887, the next one is from 1886. So it's a period where Nietzsche's looking back at his more experimental, critical period, his transition from the 1870s to the early 1880s during this time, throughout which he's reassessing what he was doing, what he's thinking, how he's responding to his influences. And so this is a long aphorism, so we're going to take it in chunks with my commentary in between. And hopefully it'll help make clear a lot of what I've been laying out to lead up to it. So without further ado, the passage, quote, "What is Romanticism? It will be remembered, perhaps, at least among my friends, that at first I assailed the modern world with some gross errors and exaggerations, but at any rate with hope in my heart. I recognized, who knows from what personal experiences, the philosophical pessimism of the 19th century as the symptom of a higher power of thought, a more daring courage and a more triumphant plenitude of life than had been characteristic of the 18th century, the age of Hume, Kant, Condillac, and the sensualists, so that the tragic view of things seemed to me the peculiar luxury of our culture, its most precious, noble, and dangerous mode of prodigality, but nevertheless, in view of its overflowing wealth, a justifiable luxury. In the same way, I interpreted for myself German music as the expression of a Dionysian power in the German soul. I thought I heard in it the earthquake, by means of which a primeval force that had been imprisoned for ages was finally finding vent, indifferent as to whether all that usually calls itself culture was thereby made to totter. It is obvious that I then misunderstood what constitutes the veritable character both of philosophical pessimism and of German music, namely, their romanticism." End quote. So to pause here, I think that's pretty easy to understand up to this point. Nietzsche felt there was something pent up in European society and culture, waiting to be released, waiting to vent, and he says, like an eruption. And he thought he saw this in Romanticism. What is this force? Why would Nietzsche see this force in Romanticism? Is sort of the question. And that force is the Dionysian, as he says. It's an artistic force that Nietzsche claims to have discovered in The Birth of Tragedy. So, in that book, Nietzsche argues that Greek tragedy as an art form, which was in its time the pinnacle of Greek society and art and culture, in which, heroic characters meet tragic ends in a story which is dramatized by actors and accompanied by a chorus. Nietzsche believes that, in contrast to Apollo, who represented the plastic arts, the visual arts, Dionysus represented the artistic forces of music. So these are Greek gods, but Nietzsche believes they had symbolic importance in the Greek mind, and that they came together to create Greek tragedy. So he believes that Apollo represented the Greek understanding of individuation, of representing the world in an objectified form to the knowing subject. So, accordingly, Apollo stands for dreams, self-reflection, and artistic creation. But Dionysus is another kind of artistic experience entirely, the experience of losing oneself rather than of creating oneself. Ego death, dissolving back into the primordial unity. Release from the tension of being a man. And so Dionysus was represented as a god of wine. He's the god of the Athenian mystery cults. He's sometimes, represented surrounded by satyrs, his these beings which are half man and half beast. Sometimes he himself has, bull's horns or ram's horns. And at the Greek mystery plays, through dramatization and through dance and song, religious truths were supposedly revealed, truths about the cycles of life, about nature, about the divine. While the contemporary views of art in Nietzsche's time tended to emphasize the Apollonian aspect of the arts, Nietzsche thinks there's this other tendency in art, this other artistic force which is ignored, which he identifies with the Dionysian. And so that's one of the great contributions of Birth of Tragedy, is this new way of understanding and categorizing different types of art, which, of course, all classifications and categorizations are just arbitrary, but by making those distinctions, you can learn things, you can bring things to light. And so in Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche brings that Dionysian element of art to light. One reason why that's useful is that Nietzsche believed, in fact, that European society was deprived of the Dionysian, because the European mind had been so long dominated by the Christian moral ideology, whereas the Dionysian mystery cults gave a voice to the animal in man, the desire to collapse back into the bestial, to lose oneself, to abandon the project of civilization and self-knowledge. Christianity, on the other hand, wants to extirpate those urges. So if you remember the episode we talked about on the body and about the master and slave morality, and also to some extent the episode on will to power, there's a difference between spiritualizing a drive or emasculating it. Emasculating it is the Christian approach. If thy eye offend thee, pluck it out. The Dionysian is that which had been plucked out of the European culture. And Nietzsche thinks this is what made us pathological to some extent, unbalanced and divided in many respects, turned against ourselves and so on. He wishes we could once again learn to spiritualize the Dionysian. And so that's why in his romanticism, he sees this great opportunity, or rather in the whole romantic movement that he comes to identify with, the possibility of the spiritualization of the animal side, the passionate side, the non-self-reflective side of mankind. We might also broadly correlate this with the unconsciousness, with the violent and sexual impulses, which are necessarily suppressed so that we can all live in civilization. But rather than plucking this element out, Nietzsche thinks we need to revive it and give it its place within our culture in a healthy manner, where we perhaps do as the Greeks did, put the expression of the beast within man into a ritual context, perhaps make it sacred, and so on. And so he sees the possibility for this in how Wagner was, supposedly reviving the spirit of the old Germanic pagans, and so on and so forth. And so Nietzsche continues with the passage, which I'll return to reading. And he starts the next paragraph by posing the same question again as he did at the beginning. So, quote, "What is Romanticism? Every art and every philosophy may be regarded as a healing and helping appliance in the service of growing, struggling life. They always presuppose suffering and sufferers. But there are two kinds of sufferers. On the one hand, those that suffer from overflowing vitality, who need Dionysian art and require a tragic view and insight into life. And on the other hand, those who suffer from reduced vitality, who seek repose, quietness, calm seas, and deliverance from themselves through art or knowledge, or else intoxication, spasm, bewilderment, and madness. All romanticism in art and knowledge responds to the twofold craving of the latter. To them Schopenhauer as well as Wagner responded, and responds, to name those most celebrated and decided romanticists who were then misunderstood by me, not, however, to their disadvantage, as may be reasonably conceded to me. The being richest in overflowing vitality, the Dionysian god and man, may not only allow himself the spectacle of the horrible and the questionable, but even the fearful deed itself, and all the luxury of destruction, disorganization, and negation. With him, evil, senselessness, and ugliness seem as it were licensed, in consequence of the overflowing plenitude of procreative fructifying power, which can convert every desert into a luxuriant orchard. Conversely, the greatest sufferer, the man poorest in vitality, would have most need of a mildness, peace, and kindliness in thought and action. He would need, if possible, a God who is specially a God of the sick, a savior. Similarly, he would have need of logic, the abstract intelligibility of existence, for logic soothes and gives confidence. In short, he would need a certain warm, fear-dispelling narrowness and imprisonment within optimistic horizons." End quote. So here Nietzsche is explaining how the romanticists that he took his fire from, Schopenhauer and Wagner, were not who he thought they were, at least in his account of things here. To put it bluntly, one either needs romanticism because they're looking for some means of growing, struggling forward to new and better things, or because they're weary and they want to put an end to all their struggling. And he says that all romanticism in art and thought has suffered from the fact that it so far has been purveyed by those who are weak and declining, who are looking to nature in order to find peace and repose and stop struggling. Those who find in an idyllic past a rest from all the strife and stress of modernity. These kinds of romanticists are, practically speaking, prone to look for an escape from the world, and they find it either through nature or asceticism, or through a return to past beliefs and values, or a more primitive way of life. And even if such things aren't possible, to at least, they come to at least regard a time before modernity as naive and simpler and more authentic. And so Nietzsche, at the end of the passage we just looked at, or that particular paragraph of it, he draws a parallel to Christianity, suggesting that such people become prone to finding hope in a savior figure and a God of the sick and weak. And so again, this is Nietzsche in 1887, retrospectively looking back on his influences of Wagner and Schopenhauer. If we flash back just briefly to what he was writing around the time when Nietzsche was making this shift in his viewpoint, in the preface to the second book of Human All Too Human, Nietzsche writes, quote, "Richard Wagner, who seemed all-conquering, was in reality only a decayed and despairing romantic. He suddenly collapsed, helpless and broken before the Christian cross." End quote. So Wagner eventually succumbs to Christianity. Schopenhauer, as we all know, for all the fascinating threads entertained by his philosophy, all the interesting framing of things, his radical take on the Kantian epistemology and his views on art and so on. Where does he end up? For all intents and purposes, as a Buddhist. What Buddhism and Christianity have in common is the rejection of the physical world, with all the sinfulness of its desires and earthly concerns, and the promise of liberation from it all. In the Buddhist case, nirvana; in the Christian case, heaven; in both cases, a world beyond, and a savior leading the way, shepherding the suffering thinker who's become weighted down by all the suffering of the world, shepherding them off into emancipation from life. And so this is what all romanticism was doing, Nietzsche claimed. He claimed that he misunderstood that kind of thinking. He mistook it for what he was looking for, or what he was looking to romanticism to do for him, as a means of inspiring life, developing life, in the same way that we might think about Nietzsche's idea of monumental history, using the historical examples as a furtherance to life. And Nietzsche also says it was to their benefit that he misunderstood Wagner and Schopenhauer. So there's some famous egotistical Nietzschean humor for you. But back to the passage in The Gay Science, What is Romanticism? Quote, "In this manner, I gradually began to understand Epicurus, the opposite of a Dionysian pessimist. In a similar way, also the Christian, who is in fact only a type of Epicurean, and like him, essentially a romanticist. and my vision has always become keener in tracing that most difficult and insidious of all forms of retrospective inference in which most mistakes have been made, the inference from the work to its author, from the deed to its doer, from the ideal to him who needs it, from every mode of thinking and valuing to the imperative want behind it. In regard to all aesthetic values, I now avail myself of this radical distinction. I ask in every single case, has hunger or superfluity become creative here? At the outset, another distinction might seem to recommend itself more. It is far more conspicuous, namely to have in view whether the desire for rigidity, for perpetuation, for being is the cause of creating, or the desire for destruction, for change, for the new, for the future, for becoming. But when looked at more carefully, both these kinds of desire prove themselves ambiguous and are explicable precisely according to the before-mentioned and, as it seems to me, rightly preferred scheme. The desire for destruction, change, and becoming may be the expression of overflowing power, pregnant with futurity. My terminus for this is, of course, the word Dionysian. But it may also be the hatred of the ill-constituted, destitute, and unfortunate, which destroys and must destroy because the enduring, yea, all that endures, in fact, all being, excites and provokes it. To understand this emotion, we have but to look closely at our anarchists." End quote. That's another, I think, bit ironical or sarcastic remark there at the end. And so this passage is extraordinarily interesting for understanding how the idea of the Dionysian developed beyond the understanding of the Dionysian as Nietzsche writes about it in Birth of Tragedy. When Nietzsche writes about Dionysus and Birth of Tragedy at that time, he's a philologist. The book itself straddles the border between philosophy and philology. But Nietzsche still writes more or less entirely within the framework of Dionysus as a phenomenon in Greek culture, and specifically within Greek artistic expression, within dramatic tragedy, but perhaps, a phenomenon we can learn from in the modern day. Specifically, maybe we can gain insights about art, but he is talking about a phenomenon in Greek culture. But here in this passage, what is Romanticism? The Dionysian has a valuation attached to it, so he's talking about it in a different sense. Now, Nietzsche would most likely claim this is not a moral valuation, but he is correlating the Dionysian with something healthy, and that is, he correlates it with becoming, and he opposes it to the world conceived of instead as being. Another way of conceiving of this dichotomy he lays out, he poses in the question he asks, is this an expression of hunger or superfluity? So, are you employing your ideas, your beliefs, your values in such a way that you are seeking new struggles, new growth, new becoming? And yes, in the process of this, the destruction of the old, of that which is decaying or weak. And this could all be referential, by the way, to yourself, destroying which is decaying and weak inside you, and promoting some sort of new growth or new struggle that you can take on to become something new and better. So are your beliefs and values pushing you forward in that sort of process? Or are your beliefs more in line with the world as being, as something static and unchanging, merely a way of rigidifying your way of life, and in fact, rigidifying your identity? So, for example, someone could wish for a return to nature, and you could then pose the question, are you wishing for a return to nature in the form of striking out into the frontier and surviving on your own with a small group, against the elements, struggling against the harshness of nature, and thus becoming something greater than you were by developing new skills and being forged in the heat of that? Or do you wish to return to nature because, you're entertaining the fantasy of returning to the Garden of Eden, repose from life? I've drank too deep from the cup of life. Is that what What is driving this? So Nietzsche poses that question that at the beginning, that what's important to him is the underlying nature which is driving forward this surface level expression of ideas. So, that's why he says he's peeking behind every mode of thinking and valuing to the imperative want that is behind it, and asking, is this an expression of hunger or superfluity? But so again, though, notice the dichotomy, the one that we mentioned at the very beginning, that he is shaping here. He ties the Dionysian to the healthy, the struggling, life-affirming, world as becoming. Did you notice anyone or anything in that passage that we just read that's connected to the sick, the dying, life-denying, the world as being? Well, he says the opposite of a Dionysian pessimist is the Christian, and which he then does connect to Epicurus. We'll talk about Epicurus in a later episode, because it's too much to bring him into this here. But just briefly, he was a negative hedonist in his moral outlook, who imagined a return to a simple, country existence in a small fraternal community. And Nietzsche here ties him to the Christian version of Romanticism. So the important dichotomy here, then, is not Apollo contrasted with Dionysus, as Nietzsche did in Birth of Tragedy. That was an earlier dialectic that Nietzsche explored, and about which he mostly made descriptive statements. Here, the contrast doesn't involve Apollo. Underlying these two contrasting worldviews are the Dionysian and the Christian. So, back to the text. Quote, "The will to perpetuation, or will to immortalize, requires equally a double interpretation. It may on the one hand proceed from gratitude and love. Art of this origin will always be an art of apotheosis, perhaps dithyrambic, as with Rubens, mocking divinely, as with Hafiz, or clear and kind-hearted, as with Goethe, and spreading a Homeric brightness and glory over everything. In this case, I speak of Apollinian art. It may also, however, be the tyrannical will of a sorely suffering, struggling, or tortured being who would like to stamp his most personal, individual, and narrow characteristics, the very idiosyncrasy of his suffering, as an obligatory law and constraint on others, who, as it were, takes revenge on all things, in that he imprints, enforces, and brands his image, the image of his torture, upon them. The latter is romantic pessimism in its most extreme form, whether it be as Schopenhauerian will philosophy or as Wagnerian music. Romantic pessimism, the last great event in the destiny of our civilization. That there may be quite a different kind of pessimism, a classical pessimism. This presentiment and vision belongs to me, as something inseparable from me, as my proprium and ipsissimum, only that the word classical is repugnant to my ears. It has become far too worn, too indefinite and indistinguishable. I call that pessimism of the future, for it is coming, I see it coming, Dionysian pessimism." End quote. And so here we have the implicit association of pessimism with romanticism once again. These are overlapping concepts. He even combines these two terms to discuss the Schopenhauerian will philosophy and Wagnerian music, romantic pessimism in the most extreme form. And here, those are two mentors of Nietzsche, and here he is speaking of their romanticism as of the negative, sick, world as being form of romanticism. And notice he includes here the Apollinian. He brings that into this analysis, Apollinian art in modern times. He mentions Goethe in this respect, for example, which makes perfect sense given his comments on Goethe and Schopenhauer as Educator. Remember that Goethe is the contemplative man. Here he says he's clear and kind-hearted and casts a Homeric brightness over everything. I think he kind of implies, yet again, with the Apollinian, it could be coming from a place of superfluity or from hunger, as he puts it, from exhaustion or from an excess of life. It could come from either one. But to look at the contrast, if Wagner and Schopenhauer represent not the Dionysian force in art, but the Christian or in Schopenhauer's case, Buddhist, although Nietzsche thinks these two religions are very similar in their core aspects, then the Dionysian force that Nietzsche believed he saw in Schopenhauer and Wagner was not there. And that's what he's telling us in this passage. They were romantics, yes, but remember, Wagner collapses before the Christian cross in Nietzsche's view by capitulating to German, Lutheran identitarianism. And Wagner ultimately he tries to use the pagan stories not as a source of the Dionysian, but as a way to rejuvenate the Christian worldview. So of the examples Nietzsche sees in art and philosophy, he sees some of the Apollonian types, and he sees some of the romantics, but they're types who nevertheless represent the recapitulation to the Christian desire to return to the garden, rather than anything Dionysian. So the return to the Dionysian impulse, the world as becoming rather than being, the desire to transform and overcome and affirm life all in one, that's all associated with the Dionysian in this passage, and yet it's not there. Nietzsche does not see it in current culture. It's something yet to come. And so, to sum up the whole passage, the Dionysian, something Nietzsche discovered in Birth of Tragedy, but which came to mean something different and more broad to Nietzsche in his later work. But the thread that defines the Dionysian in all its incarnations in Nietzsche's writing and what it always represents, no matter where he talks about it, it's the celebration or release of the animal side of man, or put another way, a release for our all too human. Because, by now it should be clear, the secret of just why it is that man is human, all too human, is because there's so much in us that is animal. And that's this observation that man still has the beast within that's continually ignored. We're hindered in our development, in overcoming our old errors of thought when we continue to look away from this fact, to willfully ignore it, and imagine ourselves as beings that did not arise from nature, but were dropped down into it, to have this belief in our own permanence of character and permanence of the human condition. And so the Dionysian represents the proper integration of the animal with the rational mind, out of the recognition that it is the animal, that is to say, the body and its drives, the blind, willing impulse, that is the driving force of life. And that's the association he's making here. The reorientation of the body and the animal urges as sacred and the reason for our existence, and putting the mind into the proper relationship with the bodily urges under that understanding. And this has to be done in some way that doesn't destroy the fruits of civilization. So, destructive as this force of the Dionysian may be, it's a destruction with the aim of transformation. It's not just destruction for the sake of destruction. And so what Nietzsche believed, he found this in Schopenhauer and Wagner, but found that what their romanticism really meant was not like this at all. And from a certain perspective, it was the very opposite of what Nietzsche was looking for. And so, as we've said, when Nietzsche digs into the heart of Schopenhauer's philosophy, it's a Buddhistic value structure that assesses life on the whole as of no value. And so that's the reason for this tension. Schopenhauer's means of elevating man beyond the natural world is to make the natural world worthless. And man's value in his role as the negator of that very real world of ours, with all its planets and star systems and galaxies, that's where man's value is found, is in that role. And through reason, through intellect, man rejects the physical. And so Schopenhauer's project, inspired as it is by Plato and Kant, is a continuation and indeed the culmination of that two worlds dualism of Western philosophy, which exists just as much in the Indian religion as well, in the form of the veil of Maya, separating the material world from the pure, undifferentiated world of the Brahman. And so that, having outlined all of that, that's giving you a taste more of Schopenhauer's pessimism, as we've looked at. And so now we're going to look at the second passage, which concerns itself with that pessimistic label, which comes a year earlier in 1886. Now, Nietzsche certainly seems to have a pessimistic aspect to him, just as he seemed, at least for some point in his career, to have a romantic aspect. But we must understand that the classification of Nietzsche as a pessimist has a greater implication for Nietzsche's philosophical project, because while Nietzsche only really identified with Romanticism for a certain period of his work during his early days, Nietzsche is sometimes called a pessimist as a description of his work as a whole. And so we've seen in the last passage how Nietzsche rejected Schopenhauer in one dimension. He rejected Schopenhauer's Romanticism by arguing that what he was looking for in Romanticism he found to be ultimately opposed to Schopenhauer's project. But what about that second dimension of pessimism? And the short answer is that Nietzsche also rejects that. But again, it's interesting the way in which he comes to reject Schopenhauer in this regard. And so this is from Nietzsche's 1886 preface to The Birth of Tragedy. And while the book Birth of Tragedy has certainly been criticized by many, including Nietzsche himself, as being raw, immature, at times overly effusive, the preface that he added later for the second publication, more than 10 years after the fact, has been called by Kaufman, among others, one of the greatest productions from Nietzsche's hand. The preface is subtitled An Attempt at Self-Criticism, and it reads as just that. And again, this is Nietzsche commenting years later on his own intellectual development that was happening in the 1870s and early 1880s. The wonderful thing about this preface, we don't have to cover Birth of Tragedy first to understand it, because Nietzsche does a good job of summarizing the ideas that it contains, and because he talks about the issues he was wrestling with in the preface in terms that are very broad and abstract. He's talking about what the underlying symbolic conflict within him was when he wrote Birth of Tragedy. It's not the direct subject of the text, but something that's incidentally talked about throughout, in a word, science. So Nietzsche writes in this preface, quote, "What I then got hold of, something frightful and dangerous, a problem with horns, but not necessarily a bull, in any case a new problem. Today I should say that it was the problem of science itself. Science considered for the first time as problematic, questionable." End quote. So, to explain this, many of the biggest figures in German philosophy, Kant, Hegel, pretty much all the neo-Kantians, express their philosophical ideas as a kind of science, or as a framework of reason through which science can be contextualized and understood. Kant, for example, argued in one of his later essays that philosophy needed to be established as one of the uppermost faculties of the German university system. And broadly speaking, this is because philosophy must be understood as the foundation which undergirds all science. And for centuries and even millennia before this, philosophy was more or less inseparable from science, with most philosophical figures contributing works, not merely in metaphysics, but also sometimes in physics and in mathematics and the other sciences. And this was all included under the banner of philosophy, whether it was natural philosophy or dialectic philosophy. And, you might also remember from episode 5, when we looked at Nietzsche's lectures on the pre-Platonic philosophers, Nietzsche himself more or less understood science as coming into being hand in hand with the development of philosophy. It's the act of doing philosophy that helps us make the leap from religion into the representation of universal existence with abstract concepts. And what that does is create the possibility of approaching the world scientifically. If we can make these representations separate from any one particular phenomenon, we can then begin to study the world in a truly scientific manner. We can derive general principles from studying specific phenomena, which is, put simply, empiricism. But here Nietzsche says that he's the first to tackle this new problem, or he's the first to regard this development, this very development of science itself, as problematic. And this is his underlying criticism in Birth of Tragedy revealed to us. And it's very telling that even at this early date, this underlying question that he's wrestling with, calling into question the value of science relative to its dangers, it basically opens the way to many of Nietzsche's later developments in thought, such as his criticisms of philosophers in Beyond Good and Evil, or talking about the congenital defect of philosophers in Human All Too Human. While Nietzsche is known for being a staunch critic of Christianity, what's interesting is that he identifies the first truly philosophical question that he wrestled with is a criticism of science. And so his criticism of Christianity and criticism of science are actually related. And this is because in Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche had already identified the true opposition to the Dionysian, which is not Apollo, but Socrates. More specifically, Euripides. But we'll get to that in a moment. Socrates is what Nietzsche calls the mystagogue of science. He's a radical skeptic. He challenges the divine assumptions of the community and in fact calls its every sacred value into question. And furthermore, he's willing to die, to be put to death for his truths. And so in doing so, in taking his hemlock, he alludes to the idea that life is merely a long illness. And so this is the portrait of a figure who's willing to sacrifice life at the altar of truth. Because, irrational as they were, if those moral values which the people hold are essential to their existence, which Nietzsche believed that they were, Socrates is actually then doing great harm to the community by challenging or questioning these beliefs. Socrates is what Nietzsche called absurdly rational. He is unartistic and believes that virtue is only undermined by artistic expression. He's the theoretical man, as Nietzsche calls him, and in the text he opposes the theoretic against the tragic. Theoretic against the tragic is really the first formulation of the it would be, I guess, in that order, the crucified versus Dionysus. But in Birth of Tragedy, he's talking about how there's artistic Greek tragedy, this force in their society that allows for the Dionysian to be expressed and sacralized. Then, in opposition to that, there's Socrates, the theoretical man, who looks at the Dionysian and only sees what is irrational, what is unvirtuous, what is a danger to the rational order of society. And then comes Euripides, a playwright who, inspired by Socrates, creates the genre of New Attic comedy. So rather than tragedy, where you're portraying larger-than-life heroes, people who, out of great passion, strive and struggle and suffer, and inevitably die due to some tragic, all-too-human flaw. In short, a dramatic representation that makes sacred what is all-too-human, which, another way of saying, what is animal within us. Euripides writes comedies in which the human condition can be contained within a limited sphere of solvable problems, on the other hand. Euripides, in short, he creates a form of art which is fundamentally optimistic rather than tragic. And Nietzsche believes that this represents the excision of the Dionysian from art. And so Socrates is the root cause of this. He stands as this absurdly rational, anti-artistic figure in Birth of Tragedy. Nietzsche writes in this preface about the, quote, silent hostility with which Christianity was regarded in Birth of Tragedy. But, everything that Socrates stands for in Birth of Tragedy, or rather everything that Socratism stands for, is not just what Nietzsche sees at the root of the scientific zeitgeist, but also the Christian moral zeitgeist within European culture. This is because, as he says in the preface to Beyond Good and Evil, Christianity is Platonism for the people. Christianity is the natural conclusion of an ideology that rejects the Dionysian. If you attempt to excise the Dionysian, to emasculate the animal impulses in mankind and call them evil and sinful, that inevitably eventually develops into a rejection of the physical world. One associates themselves entirely with the conscious mind as this disembodied thing, as an immortal soul. One rejects the urges of the flesh and feels ashamed of them, and life itself becomes a stifled, botched thing. To Nietzsche, that's where the war of the theoretic versus the tragic eventually leads. And so it's a very different picture of the relationship between science and religion that we have in our modern times. But this is how the problem of science, as Nietzsche sees it, gives way to the problem of Christianity, the emergence of Socratism is the emergence of a worldview that rejects life in favor of truth and rejects art in favor of science. The emergence of Christianity, it's a later development, but it's the same pattern. The rejection of life in favor of truth, the rejection of passion in favor of reason, the rejection of the worldly in favor of the otherworldly. And so Nietzsche writes in this 1886 preface to The Birth of Tragedy, quote, "You will guess where the big question mark concerning the value of existence had thus been raised. Is pessimism necessarily a sign of decline, decay, degeneration, weary and weak instincts, as it once was in India and now is to all appearances among us modern men and Europeans? Is there a pessimism of strength? An intellectual predilection for the hard, gruesome, evil, problematic aspect of existence, prompted by well-being, by overflowing health, by the fullness of existence? Is it perhaps possible to suffer precisely from overfullness, the sharp-eyed courage that tempts and attempts, that craves the frightful as the enemy, the worthy enemy, against whom one can test one's strength, from whom one can learn what it means to be frightened? What is the significance of the tragic myth among the Greeks of the best, the strongest, and most courageous period, and the tremendous phenomenon of the Dionysian, and born from it tragedy? And what might they signify? And again, that of which tragedy died, the Socratism of morality, the dialectics, frugality, and cheerfulness of the theoretical man. And now? Might not this very Socratism be a sign of decline, or weariness, of infection, of the anarchical dissolution of the instincts? And the Greek cheerfulness of the later Greeks, merely the afterglow of the sunset? The Epicureans' resolve against pessimism, a mere precaution for the afflicted? And science itself, our science, indeed, what is the significance of all science, viewed as a symptom of life? For what? Worse yet, whence all science? How now? Is the resolve to be so scientific about everything perhaps a kind of fear of, an escape from pessimism? A subtle last resort against truth? And, morally speaking, a sort of cowardice and falseness? Amorally speaking, a ruse? O Socrates, Socrates, was that perhaps your secret? O enigmatic ironist, was that perhaps your irony?" End quote. I believe I talked about that passage in the episode on Nietzsche versus Socrates as well. But after all we've talked about, I think it's fairly straightforward that Nietzsche saw the power of science, but also saw the danger of science, which is to say, the danger of the sacralization of truth-seeking above all other values. The danger is that this truth-seeking impulse will saw off the Dionysian. And so might not this Socratism be a sign of weakness, an escape into this abstract world of logic, a means of staving off pessimism? And notice the suggestion he makes in the passage. Is there a pessimism of strength? Which implies, of course, that there's a pessimism of weakness. And with this last dichotomy, we get our final answer, I think, concerning Schopenhauer. And he addresses Schopenhauer directly in the preface, where he writes, quote, "What, after all, did Schopenhauer think of tragedy? That which bestows on everything tragic its peculiar elevating force," he says in World as Will and Representation, "is the discovery that the world, that life, can never give real satisfaction, and hence is not worthy of our affection. This constitutes the tragic spirit. It leads to resignation." How differently Dionysus spoke to me. How far removed I was from all this resignationism. But there is something worse in this book, something I now regret still more than that I obscured and spoiled Dionysian premonitions with Schopenhauerian formulations. End quote. And something worse he's talking about in the book is It's how he fears he spoiled Dionysus by linking the Dionysian too much to our modern problems, or linking his understanding of the Dionysian and the Apollonian in light of our modern issues. Modern then referring to, I mean, he's basically talking about how he polluted the text with too much Wagnerianism, is the short version. And of course, the other thing that he mentions, that he considered the Dionysian Apollonian in light of Schopenhauer's ideas on art. But more to the point, Schopenhauer more or less demonstrates in the section Nietzsche quotes from that his pessimism is the pessimism of weakness that Nietzsche was implying earlier. Schopenhauer does not look to tragedy as a means of enhancing life, but out of weariness and a desire to be free of the suffering of life. He suggests that that's what tragedy entices us to do, to come to reject life more easily, I suppose. And so, but we have our answer. Schopenhauer is a romantic, but his romantic need comes from a need to escape, a need for repose. He's a pessimist, but he's a pessimist of weakness rather than a pessimist of strength. To the extent that Nietzsche is either a romantic or a pessimist, it's the extent to which either can be brought into the service of life, for the furthering and advancement of life. Schopenhauer, an inspiration though he was, as the solitary, independent philosopher, and as the romantic hero who stood in contradistinction to his age, he didn't understand the need for the Dionysian impulse. And he ends up, as a result, giving in to the Christian impulse, you could say. You could say the Dionysian is what Nietzsche is looking for, because this is what he sees as needed for the furtherance of life. It's the problem underlying his whole work in some sense, or this is how the problem has transformed and made itself more clear, that he needs some means of incorporating the Dionysian into our culture once again. And Nietzsche, elsewhere in the preface, he called this Dionysian instinct within himself. He says that he experienced it as, quote, artistic and anti-Christian. And so he writes further, quote, "What to call it? As a philologist and man of words, I baptized it, not without taking some liberty, for who could claim to know the rightful name of the Antichrist? In the name of a Greek god, I called it Dionysian," end quote. And so that reveals the meaning of Nietzsche's rather straightforward statement elsewhere in Ecce Homo, that the dichotomy running throughout his entire work is Dionysus versus the crucified. And this is the key that explains his overcoming of Schopenhauer. Romanticism and pessimism, these troublesome words that can mean 100 things or nothing, depending on who is using them, these are only ideologies, or you could call them thought movements, and so they're superficial categories to Nietzsche. What matters to him is the inner content, the maxim or the valuation or the demand behind them as he sees it. And through this search for a pessimism of strength, the search for a romanticism that affirms life, Nietzsche discovers his fundamental difference with some among his most influential mentors: Schopenhauer, his philosophical mentor, and Wagner, a mentor he knew personally, whose friendship he once cherished, and whose art and ideas moved Nietzsche. Meanwhile, in other figures, such as Heraclitus, he discovers, and to some extent Goethe, a very deep spiritual sense of agreement. Goethe, who's understood the limits of the theoretical life and the need for the Dionysian, as he expresses these in different terms in Faust, or Heraclitus, who represented the world as becoming. All of these figures I just mentioned, Schopenhauer, Wagner, Goethe, Heraclitus, these are all people Nietzsche admired and learned from. But Nietzsche came to evaluate all of these figures very differently in the end, once he took stock of them, according to this simple formula of Dionysus versus the crucified. And the question he poses is always whether the idea in question fosters life and leads to the furtherance of mankind. Is this a path to something greater? For all Schopenhauer's image of man provides in our quest for self-betterment, Schopenhauer himself must be overcome because he fails to understand the necessity of the Dionysian. And so without this life-giving element, he atrophies into a life denier. And so that's not to say that Schopenhauer represents, quote-unquote, the crucified in, his inner spirit, but rather that Schopenhauer does not confront this opposition between the two. He doesn't provide this needed Dionysian element, and so therefore he has no defense against the ideological force of the crucified, or however you want to put it. His philosophy cannot affirm life, and thus it must deny it. That's the inevitable end. And so I hope now you have you have much more than merely a final episode on the relationship between Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, but perhaps a new perspective from which to look at Nietzsche's philosophy. The recognition of the beast within as something that, if properly reintegrated into mankind, can be the thing that elevates us, or rather that the creation of a higher man, a more fully realized mankind, is actually not to be found by casting out the beast, and that the people who tried to do so, who tried to excise the Dionysian, who didn't understand this relationship and the fact that the Dionysian is the source of life, the source of becoming and transformation within us, to put it in rather poetic and abstract terms. Not understanding that leads to life denial. And that's the overcoming of Schopenhauer. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it, or on social media. Thank you for your support.